Hello.
Hi everyone, how you doing? Thank you so much for joining us. It's another strange day in a long line of strange days. This is the first time we've attempted one of these reading clubs ever, let alone try it online. So thank you very much for being our collective guinea pigs. We really appreciate it. Today we're going to be speaking to James, who you can see in the sidebar, hopefully, about his excellent piece from the latest issue about football in Qatar. I want to start it off, though, by just saying thank you so much for everyone for continuing to support Delayed Gratification and the work that we've been doing. We really, really appreciate it. We literally can't do it without you. So we love that. Rob and I started the magazine. Rob, you can see under the strange name Questions. I believe that's just his position in life. But that's so you can ask him questions later. But when Rob and I started this magazine back in 2010, the first issue we put out had the WikiLeaks story in it. And I remember us sitting around thinking, God, are we ever going to see such strange days again? And now we find ourselves in 10 years' time dealing in a totally different world than even that we had in December. But hopefully a world where slow journalism is more needed than anything. But that's it about the magazine. We're going to go on and talk about this issue. This is, as we were mentioning, like the first in a series of online classes that we're doing. Some of them are free, some of them are kind of paid for. You know, all the money that we generate from the classes is going back into investing in investigative journalism for the future issues, and including one by James himself, who's going to be teaching how to be a non-fiction author. So if any of you have got a book in you, check out the events and classes page on slowjournalism.com and see what you fancy. We've also got a pub quiz next week, I think at 8:15 next week. If anyone fancies testing their mental mettle, it should be a good night, hopefully. And we've got free gin for the winners, so especially good. Yeah, thank you for joining us. I'm gonna little bit of housekeeping. We don't have to worry about the fire escapes. If you hear a fire alarm, your house is on fire, run. But for the rest of you, bear with us. This is the first time we've done this. There may be some teething problems. My jokes don't get any better. Although it might say in the corner we're videoing this, we're only videoing the speakers. And the rest of you are on mute. So it'll only be James, myself, and questions that get recorded. It's nice if you can keep your video on so we can see you and see how it's going down. But we are going to try and take some snapshots at the end. So if you feel uncomfortable with that, then turn your video off then, but we'll give you a call. We'll give you a kind of warning about that. We have muted everyone just in case of background noise. We've had it before and it's got a bit confusing. But please do ask questions. Just click the chat icon in the bottom bar and send a message to questions. That's Rob. Rob will be kind of collating them together and then putting them during the Q&A session or interrupting us as we go, if needs be, if there's something that's not there. So, all part of the game. So James is one of the founding editors of DG as well. For those of you who don't know, DG was started by 5 of us, and James was one of those founders. He's written some of the best pieces we've ever published in a magazine, and I'll put this one amongst them. So it's a terrific piece. So I'm going to throw over to James if you'd like to introduce the piece a little bit, and then maybe a little bit of a reading from the start.
Yeah. Hello, and especially to Susie Dale, because you're the only person I can see at the bottom of my I've got four faces and you're there as well, so hello. So yeah, I'm one of the founding editors of DG. We all met together in Dubai, actually working as journalists on Time Out Dubai. We lived in the Gulf and we experienced a very different time in the world and also a very different time in the Gulf. And one of those things we experienced was Qatar, which then was a very different place, very unknown. And it suddenly became quite literally one of the most famous countries in the world, off of football, off of its successful bid eventually to win, to host the 2022 World Cup finals. And so that's kind of started me personally on a kind of 15-year journey, reporting especially on football in the Middle East. I wrote a book called When Friday Comes, which Qatar actually was the first chapter of my first book. So it's kind of gone full circle to the 2019 Club World Cup, which took place in December, which I went to, travelled with the Flamengo fans from Rio de Janeiro. And it was a time for me, I've reported many times from Qatar over the years, it was a time for me to look at how things have changed there, how many of the big issues that have been brought up, in particular when it came to worker rights, the political dimension when it comes to the Gulf blockade, and ultimately what the fan experience is going to be if the World Cup goes ahead, which is still amazingly a question mark that still hangs over it. So I'm going to read you the opening few lines of the story to kind of, I don't know, get us in the mood, I guess. So from the current issue. The Khalifa International Stadium in the Qatari capital of Doha was built for moments like these. Thousands of fans from across the world line its stands to watch the first semi-final of the 2019 FIFA Club World Cup, a yearly tournament in which the champions of 6 continents compete for the right to call themselves the best club team in the world. Today, the champions of South America take on those of Asia, Flamengo from Brazil against Al Hilal of Saudi Arabia. Tomorrow, Liverpool will play Mexico's Monterrey for the other place in the final. While for most of its life, the Club World Cup has been a largely unloved inconvenience for European teams, for South American clubs, it has offered a prized opportunity to show their rivals where the real talent in world football lies. While Liverpool fans complained about fixture congestion and the 6-hour flight to Doha, Flamengo had brought nearly 30,000 fans from the other side of the world. I'd flown with them from Rio to Sao Paulo to Doha via Casablanca. When the team coach left for the Galileo airport, thousands of people took a day off work to line the streets and cheer them on their way. This year's competition, though, promises more of a spectacle than usual, and not just because some of the biggest stars of the game will be here, including Liverpool's Mohamed Salah and Flamengo striker Gabriel Gabigol Barbosa. It's also, after nearly 10 years of speculation, lurid revelations, accusations of worker mistreatment and geopolitical shenanigans, a chance for the world to finally see what a global football tournament in Qatar really looks like. There are big questions to be answered. How will Qatar handle thousands of boisterous fans? Can a country where the average attendance of a league match is 672, despite the average capacity of a stadium being 14,000, genuinely fall in love with the beautiful game? What has become of the thousands of workers involved in the construction of the tournament's infrastructure? And will Qatar's huge bet on the World Cup, which by some estimates will cost the country as much as £150 billion, pay off for the country? At the Club World Cup, the fans certainly seem to be having a good time. In the stands behind the goal, as kick-off nears, a motley crew wearing Flamengo's red and white, black and red striped shirts is being roused to song by an exuberant conductor. Barely in his 20s, Benfica is a member of the Raça Rubro-Negra, Brazil's biggest torcida organizada, organised fan group, which has existed since the 1940s. I'm a director, he says, responsible for choosing the songs and motivating the crowd. The Raça Rubro-Negra began singing an hour before kickoff. They've even written a song especially for the occasion. It celebrates the time Flamengo beat Liverpool 3-0 in the 1981 Intercontinental Cup, the forerunner to the Club World Cup. With his back to the field, Benfica leads the crowd. In December 1981, you put the Englishman in circles. 3-0 against Liverpool. It left a mark on history. And in Rio, there's no one like you. Only Flamengo is world champion. And now your people ask for the world again. The game begins and the singing stops abruptly in the 18th minute when underdogs Al Hilal take a shock lead. Benfica demands his choir start up again, but louder. With their Brazilian-style drums keeping time, the torcida urges Flamengo forward. They score 3 without reply. Men weep with joy. A woman repeatedly kisses a necklace with the face of Jesus on it. Flamengo in the final. Benfica stands on his chair and finally turns towards the pitch. Fuck you, Europe, he shouts.
Thank you very much, James.
Apologies for the language at the end.
It gets worse. It's fantastic. And it goes on, for those that haven't read the story, we go on to kind of unpack the Club World Cup, look at the different elements within it. For this kind of session tonight, I'm going to try and take you back and talk through the entire history. You know, this is the slowest of slow journalism. Monty's been covering this story for 15 years, kind of dedicatedly. But I want to start asking you, Rob, asking you, James, is why should anyone who doesn't care about football care about this story?
I mean, it has everything, really. It has geopolitical intrigue. It is part and parcel of the biggest game in the world. The World Cup is probably the single biggest event in the world. I mean, that and the Olympics. And so what became originally a very kind of, it was a very kind of minor story. I mean, it's a small country in the Gulf, Qatar. Very few people before 2010 had heard of it. But by winning the bid to win the 2022 World Cup in December 2010, when Sepp Blatter famously pulled out the envelope with its name on, for a lot of people, they were hearing that name for the first time. And this was a country that had only existed for 40 years, had a tiny population, smaller than kind of many towns or cities in Britain.
Yeah, it was incredible. I tried to do an infographic, like looking at, DG's famous for infographics. I thought I'd put together a quick one on this, just kind of comparing the population sizes of the countries that were bidding for the 2022 World Cup. And I couldn't find a scale where you could get Qatar's population on the same page as the USA, which was the real favourite to win this tournament. It really is a minnow in kind of geopolitical terms, but is punching well above its weight.
Yeah, it's a minnow in size, but per capita, is one of the richest countries in the world, thanks to its huge natural gas deposits. And because of that, and because it hosts CENTCOM, which is the Central Command of the US military in the Middle East and Asia, it has US troops stationed on its land. It has a massive outsized political influence. I mean, economically as well. I mean, it invests heavily around the world, especially in London. I mean, London is one of the places where Qatar has invested billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of pounds to keep the economy kind of rolling in London. So this is a country that in the past 20 years has used its money and has cleverly positioned itself as indispensable to, the world's major powers. And sport has played a really important role in how Qatar has got its foot onto that ladder.
Well, let's take this back then. Let's go back to 2005, which was when you first went to Qatar, I think on an assignment I sent you to. Do you want to talk about why you were there and kind of what you witnessed in those early days?
Well, we were working at Time Out Dubai, as I explained, and we got an email from a PR person saying, I don't know if you'd be interested in this, but Maradona and Pele will be on the same stage together in Qatar. And Rob and Marcus aren't that massive football fans. Well, actually, you're quite a big football fan, aren't you, Marcus? But
Rob, Leicester City fans, so that's
okay,
what that counts.
And it was like there was like a clamour who's going to go, and I didn't beat anyone to death or anything, but I managed to get that golden ticket to go and see. But it was essentially what was happening was the Aspire Academy was being opened, and it felt like, to all intents and purposes, that this was like somebody was opening a leisure centre. Like, it's a massive leisure centre that's being opened in Qatar, and somehow they've paid Pele and Maradona to be on stage together at the same time to discuss their rivalry. Now, the background of that rivalry is quite interesting, because for years they've been sniping between each other about who had been the greatest player of all time. And FIFA put this up to the vote in 2000, an online vote, which Maradona won handsomely. So they changed it. They announced them both to be joint winners. And it seemed to kind of, the football purists loved Pele, but people loved Maradona because he was a flawed genius, because of the cocaine use, because of the drug bans, because of the women, because of everything that he'd done in his life. So getting these two, they paid a huge amount of money to get there. And even then, I wasn't aware of the significance of why it was that the Qataris were paying this amount of money. I mean, they'd already paid huge amounts of money in their local football league to get people like Marcel Desailly to come and play his last season in the Q League at the time.
Yeah, and this was way before kind of like Major League Soccer in the US or China's kind of got that history of paying big bucks for players towards the end of their career.
There's been a few. I mean, that kind of way of trying to build your league's reputation and build your country's reputation is quite an old. Colombia did it in the 1950s very briefly. You had the failed soccer experiment in America in the 1970s as well. I mean, you famously had Beckenbauer, Pele, and Johan Cruyff go and play there. It didn't really work out. But this was kind of the reimagining of this, and they paid this huge amount of money. And it was only over time that I realised what Aspire was, and it wasn't this glorified, place to go and play squash with your mates. It was an academy that had been set up essentially to nurture the best talent they could find in the best facilities possible in Qatar to find the best players. But then it grew into something that was also trying to find talent all around the world and bring it to Qatar and nurture it in Qatar. And there was one particular very controversial program called the Football Dreams program, which goes to Africa, and there's academies all over West Africa where the very best young talent is spotted and then brought to Qatar. It's very controversial because in Africa, in places like Senegal, quite right, they're like, well, you're taking our talent and taking it to Qatar. Sometimes those players become Qatari citizens and then end up playing for various levels of the Qatari national team. And sometimes they don't, but a lot of times they do. So it's like you're stealing our talent. Whereas actually a lot of people in Qatar, especially the players that make that choice, say, you know, we'll grow up in a life of poverty, and what they're offering us is, you know, education, housing, things that we couldn't have had in our home country. So it's extremely controversial. So Aspire becomes the linchpin of what then becomes their next big project, which is to try to host the World Cup, which is something that, I mean, Rob and Marcus will remember this. Living in the Gulf in the mid-2000s, it seemed like every single sports event was trying, like the UAE, especially Dubai, was trying to buy every single golf event that came up, get an F1 Grand Prix in the city, which they failed to do, but something they desperately tried to get.
Abu Dhabi, didn't it?
Yeah, in Abu Dhabi in the end. But what they were desperate to do was to try to kind of build legitimacy and a platform and advertising for their country. They had a lot of money. Very capable people who are running these countries thought that sport and the best billboard in the world is a Premier League game, is an F1 race, is a LPGA tournament. Get your name on those things. People consider you an equal country, and it was really part of state policy that this was going ahead. And Aspire was absolutely kind of crucial in trying to build the support within FIFA and within its confederations to get the votes so that they could win that. I mean, this wasn't the first tournament they went for. They famously went for the Olympics as well. And that failed miserably because the IOC, not known for being particularly forward-looking in those kind of things, pointed out that the temperature is 50 degrees in the summer. You can't host an Olympics then. But it didn't stop Qatar from then, you know, a long shot bid for the 2010, for the 2022 World Cup finals. But moving towards 2010, it looked like it was like, this is a crazy idea. FIFA went and looked at all the bids possible, including the US bid, and Qatar was labelled high risk because of the temperature.
Yeah.
And so we get to the 2010 vote in Zurich, and Sepp Blatter pulls this name out, which I think he kind of mangles the pronunciation of it as well. But what this does is then it opens up a ton of bricks on FIFA, on Qatar, on everybody that was involved in the voting process. Because how could Qatar win this vote? I mean, to some people like me and other people who had been to Qatar and the UAE and the Gulf and had followed FIFA, it wasn't that much of a surprise, because one of Blatter's main policies was trying to spread football around the world. That was his thing. That was how he wanted to move power away from Western Europe, where the money was, and spread it round to, I mean, there was a noble aim at the bottom of it that got polluted in the end. But that was his, that was what he aimed for. I mean, this guy was instrumental in FIFA recognising a national team of Palestine, for instance, in 1998. I mean, this is, he was pushing for North Korea and South Korea to play, perhaps even a World Cup in 2002. So, I mean, he visited Pyongyang long before Infantino did. So it wasn't so much of a surprise for people who'd been watching it very closely, because you could see why they'd made that decision. But the more you looked into it and the more facts that came out around it, you realised that it was a deeply flawed process, and Aspire had been used as essentially a kind of, an arm of the Qatari state to invest in certain countries. What you'd find is Aspire academies would end up, or Aspire funded academies would end up in the countries where the people that were voting on who should have the World Cup were from. So there was the executive committee, which was 25 people strong, 24 men, sorry. Only 22 voted in the end, because 2 had been removed already for accusations of corruption. And if you look at places like Thailand, Honduras, places like that, where you had members of the Exco from those countries, you also found Paraguay. You also found Aspire academies had been built there. It was so it had become it became an essential tool, soft power tool in obtaining the World Cup in a kind of
the leisure centre that took over the world.
Yeah, well, that's it. And it wasn't, they weren't necessarily breaking the rules, because at that point, the rules were extremely flexible, and they pushed it as far as they could. And that wasn't necessarily against the rules. But they played a very dirty game better than everybody else. And that's how they won. And of course, I was told a brilliant story.
Is this a libelous story?
No. Well, no, it's in a book. It's in a book. So, I'm hoping that it's not libelous because of that. But about how, because when the vote was taking place, it was in Zurich, it was a den of intrigue. You have someone like Christopher Steele, for instance, who we know as the guy who, wrote the dodgy dossier about Trump. He was working for the English FA, doing, trying to find out stuff about all the other bids. You've got people at that level working to find out on other people in the bid. And one story I heard was as soon as the Russian bid turned up, everybody's mobile phone stopped working because they put the FSB were there. They jammed all the communications. This was at the very, very highest level, political level. You had deals between heads of states, in the run up to this as well. So there's the famous meeting in the Elysee Palace between Michel Platini, who was a member of the Exco at the time, head of UEFA, who he has a meeting with Nicolas Sarkozy in the Elysee Palace alongside the Crown Prince of Qatar, where they allegedly discuss the bid, and if the bid goes ahead, whether PSG's debts might be cleared and eventually bought. PSG end up being bought by an investment fund backed by the Qatari state. So once you started looking at this shock vote, you realised that underneath it, there was this absolute, this was politics at the very highest level. And football and Qatar had become absolutely entwined with it all. And of course, Russia, because the vote took place on the same day. So Russia won the 2018 bid, which took place obviously 2 summers ago, or would be 2 years ago in this summer. And Qatar won 2022. And really, that's the beginning of Qatar's problems, because they wished for this. They've been digging for gold for so long. But what had happened once they'd achieved what they'd always wanted to have, it brought so much scrutiny on them that it made many people in the country, and there's not that many, but many people in the country question whether this was something that we should have even gone for in the first place.
Well, so the scrutiny came from both the political, legal side. So this is the DOJ, the Department of Justice in the US, who actually brought charges in 2015. Do you want to talk us through those briefly, and then we'll go on to talk about the changes within Qatar itself, and particularly the kind of construction side of the
World Cup. As soon as this comes out, what happens? I was in Qatar the month after this event. This was mentioned. This once they won the bid, and the people were extremely proud. There was pictures of Emir Hamid Al Thani, the kind of garrulous big emir, who's big kind of moustache. And there's pictures of him everywhere, kind of holding the World Cup, not wearing his kind of thobe, wearing kind of Western style suit, but there's pictures of him everywhere. And they were very, very proud that they were going to host it. But I was there for the Asian Cup, and straight away, people started asking questions about how the country was being run. What's happening to the worker population? What's happened with these deals? What was being paid under the table? And there'd always been accusations about corruption within FIFA. And this culminates ultimately in the 2015 DOJ kind of indictments, which lead to 14 FIFA executives being indicted and 7 arrested at the Bauerlack Hotel in Zurich on May the 27th, I think it was. And a lot of them weren't connected directly to the Qatar, to accusations towards Qatar, but it blew open just what a filthy business FIFA and the confederations were involved in terms of kind of vote buying when it comes to contracts, when it came to kind of media rights, kind of confederation elections, all these kind of things. And this happened just before they'd all been gathered to vote on who's going to be the next, FIFA president. Sepp Blatter was going to be a valedictory kind of like moment. He wins the election, this kind of sordid moment, and then basically backs down. And what we have in a situation, I mean, these are ongoing criminal investigation, and in fact, we've had in the past few weeks more indictments which make explicit accusations of vote buying made towards Qatar's bid and Russia's bid as well. But this really blew up the entire situation. I mean, totally. I mean, by now, when you look at it, I mean, I think half of those 24 executive committee members. I mean, I think there's only one member that still sits on the FIFA Council. But it was really the end of an era and the beginning of a new one, or supposedly the end of an era and the beginning of a new one, and ushered in the era of Gianni Infantino. But ever since, it's the accusations that have surrounded the vote, what happened before the vote, and then the issues which are much more deeper when it comes to what's going on in Qatari society and their economy come to the fore and really start to put a lot of political pressure on them to change the way that the country is being run.
Well, I mean, the way the country's built as well, and particularly that, like, there's a lot of reports about kind of abuse of particularly migrant workers, building the stadiums, trying to prepare the country for this World Cup. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about a character from the story, which is Arman, which is the Bangladeshi migrant you've been in touch with for years now. Yeah,
well, I mean, I use a pseudonym, of course, but he is a guy I met actually when I was researching my last book, which is called The Billionaires Club, and it's a book about how the super rich have taken over football and why they're terrible and why they're ruining it all. And I think that could pretty much be taken with the super rich in almost every area of the economy and of society. But what I wanted to do is, because one of the things that was very clear from me moving to the Middle East for the first time in 2004, and for you as well, and Rob, I remember us having conversations about this, was very clear, very quickly when we arrived, the exploitation and the appalling conditions that migrant workers were being treated in Dubai. And this was something that was being replicated to greater or lesser, but to a fairly similar fashion all across the Gulf. And this was the system of kafala essentially allows this to happen. It's a kind of sponsorship system where the employer is completely dependent on you. You're dependent completely on the employer. The employer's in charge. He's your accommodation, your movements. You have a lot of the times you didn't have your passport. You're completely at their grace and favour. And it was a open book, open season for massive exploitation. And I mean, I remember the first time I actually went into one of these camps in Dubai, where they were building the biggest mall in the world at the time, and it was right next to the offices of Balfour Beatty, which was the company that was effectively they were their workers, I mean, subcontracted. And I went into these offices and I did a story for it about the big issue. And went into the camp, and literally there was sewage running through these guys' camps. They were working in 50 degrees heat, often without a day off. Dozens of men were dying every month from like unnatural heart attacks. They were getting them in their early 30s, early 40s. Nobody was keeping count of who was dying. The men I was speaking to were trapped. They were indentured slaves. They borrowed money on the promise of going and getting a better life in Dubai and in the Gulf. And when they'd got there, because they were so easily exploited, their wages were halved. And because they owed this money back home, they could never leave. And there was an element of shame as well. To the point where I actually spoke to one worker who told me that it was quite common for people to consider and talk about suicide, because if they went to the Sheikh Zayed Road, which is a massive kind of 8-lane highway, and threw themselves in front of a car, then their family would get blood money from whoever was the unfortunate person that ran them over, and that they felt they were worth more to their families dead than alive. And this was something that was, I think, all of us that worked there were absolutely furious about, and we were not allowed really to report on it. And even Western media, I mean, I'm considered like British newspapers that I would go with this story to, they weren't interested either, because their story was, we want to talk about the Gulf, we want to talk about this economic miracle, Dubai being this holiday place. And so it was something that no one really before 2010 really gave a shit about. And then Qatar wins the World Cup, and suddenly it becomes an issue because of the power of football and the power of the World Cup, where they're like, hang on a second, who's going to be building these stadiums? Who's going to be building the hotels? Oh my God. Okay. And so it brought, for me, one of the great shames of 21st century capitalism, this massive movement of people, from Asia to the Middle East, to be exploited in their millions and sent home broken and psychologically damaged, sometimes in body bags. It brought it to a wider audience. And when I went to Bangladesh for the Billionaires Club, I met this one guy who was on his way at the airport, on his way going to Qatar. And I wanted to track him going to Qatar with all the hope that he had, and see how his life had been. And we've kept in contact ever since 2016. And in this story, I go and meet him and see how he's done. And what's interesting is that he's done kind of okay. I often keep in contact with him on WhatsApp, and he will tell me when the political crisis that broke over the Gulf blockade, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a second, he was telling me about the fact that there was no milk, the food was short, business was really bad, a lot of businesses were shutting down, working in high heat, but yet he had a doctor. The point was that what I found from him was that life was pretty hard for him. I mean, much harder than anybody else if you're going as a migrant worker somewhere. But things had changed sufficiently. So the horror stories that I had seen in 2004 to 2011 in the UAE and in Qatar as well, I'd seen many similar. In 2016 even, I'd seen these kind of scenes in Qatar. His experience had been one of it's not exactly great, but it certainly has seen a massive improvement, largely because of the huge pressure that's been put on them, mainly by journalists, I have to say. I mean, it's mainly by the media, has shamed Qatar into changing its ways, which it tentatively has. There's now a lot, kafala they've announced is going to be abolished, but we'll see if that works in practicality. But certainly when I speak to workers now, and I'm in contact with a lot of them across the Gulf, they would say now Qatar is probably a better place to be than almost anywhere else in the Gulf, especially more than Abu Dhabi and Dubai.
Perfect. I'm going to skip forward because I'm very aware that we've got running slightly out of time, and I want to make sure that there's time for lots of questions. So I'm going to skip forward to like your most recent visit, 2019, 2020. And what a lot of people, including myself, would like to know is kind of what's a major tournament like that? This is a Islamic country where presumably you can't drink freely. The temperature, I know you were there in the winter, this was a winter tournament, but the summer's, the temperature's outrageous. It's not really very built up for walking around. What's it going to be? What's the fan experience going to be like for the world, people traveling for the World Cup?
Well, the major change, of course, is that they moved it to being a winter World Cup. So when I was there in December is kind of how the weather is going to be when the World Cup takes place, if it takes place, of course, because of COVID, everything's got a question mark on it.
Don't talk about COVID.
Don't mention COVID. We
promised we wouldn't mention COVID.
Sorry,
give everyone a break.
But yeah, it was, the weather was I've been there in December and January, where people have been wearing ski jackets. I mean, admittedly, it was like 15 degrees, which is like a summer in Britain, but 15 degrees, it doesn't get to 15 degrees during the day often in Qatar. So, and it can be very wet. So it rained quite a lot. It rained quite heavily at times. So in terms of the weather, it was pretty decent. In terms of the infrastructure, the stadiums are coming along. It's going to be a very compact World Cup. They have finished building a quite extensive metro system that's very cheap to use, and you can get to all the stadiums no problem. There's going to be a problem with capacity when it comes to hotels. The big thing, of course, is the culture, which is there is no drinking culture there. I mean, you can get a drink, you can drink alcohol in Qatar. It's massively taxed. So a pint can cost you 15 quid in the wrong pint. I bought a pint of Guinness for 15 quid, which pissed me off no end. But they're going to have fan zones where fans are going to drink, where they can get a €4, €5 beer. So there will be places to go, but it's not going to be like Germany or Russia where you can drink out the streets with a kind of party atmosphere like that. Saying that, I was with Brazilian fans who are known for, like, you know, I've been with these guys in Rio celebrating seeing the team off. You know, everybody gets smashed. It's a fantastic experience. They still had a fantastic time without alcohol. And that's the thing. I mean, I love Middle Eastern culture. I love Arab culture. I mean, I wrote a book about football in the region. Going to these games and being in these countries, especially in a country like Qatar, is fascinating. And as long as you're not going to be too hung up on the, you know, incessantly wanting to drink all the time on the streets, and understand that it's not a cultural thing for people to drink. I mean, it's much more, I mean, like, for instance, I mean, certainly in other areas in the Middle East, I found that people don't drink, but I mean, they still want to get wired. So usually you find, you know, hashish is a big thing. You know, so people find a way. They always find a way. So in terms of a fan experience, I think it will be decent. It will be expensive. But I don't think it's something that, I mean, they're not, I mean, we'll see the pictures now. One of the things is that they don't really have any experience of what to do with football crowds. I mean, I've just written a book about ultras called 1312, and the Esperance from Tunisia famously have a great ultra scene in Tunisia, and they turned up and they just weren't listening to anything the police said, and they never really experienced this before because they're used to having absolute control over a cowed population, mainly because 90% of the population are migrant workers who, if they break the law, can be deported at a moment's notice. So nobody really, you don't really get civil disobedience. This was proper civil disobedience. Flares going off. It was the first time they had pyro in a stadium in Qatar. They rushed the front of the stadium to get in to hide it, and the police didn't know what to do. They'd wrapped their banners around themselves and not gone through FIFA to get approvals. They had all these illegal banners in the stadium, and they just did not know what to do, and so they ended up just wading in. And I was standing next to these guys when the batons came flaying in. So I think it's going to be they're going to need a little bit more practice with that. So they're going to have a couple of more Club World Cups to hone it. But in terms of an experience that people will never forget, in terms of how interesting it is a place, I think, you know, there is still a lot to be said for a World Cup in the Gulf, and I think it will surprise a lot of people.
Perfect. With that, I'd like to turn it over to any questions from questions, if we've got any.
We've got some nice ones. So let's start off. So nice question from Stuart, who says, have we not learned by now that the only people who actually benefit from World Cups are FIFA itself? Is Qatar any different? And mentions that he was in South Africa before, during and after the 2010 World Cup. There was a lot of hype about the legacy of the tournament, all the positive impacts on local soccer, which doesn't seem to have amounted to much.
Absolutely. I mean, there's nothing that pisses me off more than talk of legacy at tournaments. I mean, even the 2012 Olympics, you know, legacy, people can be playing more sport. Like, why would people be playing more sport? Why not just build free fields for people to play on rather than the stadium they will never get access to or afford to be in? South Africa was another case in point, which is, you know, they talk with this airy-fairy bollocks about legacy, and none of it really comes to pass. Same with Brazil. I mean, there were stadiums falling to pieces within 6 months of the end of the stadium, the end of the tournament. Qatar's a little bit different in that one thing that I think they talked a lot about legacy of Qatar, like this is going to be a tournament for the region, right? For the Middle East, for the Arab world, right? For the Islamic world, right? But then what happens is you have this massive fallout between Qatar and its neighbours where they're basically blockaded, and the World Cup becomes a central pillar of the information war that's going on between the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince, and Saudi Arabia, their Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, and Qatar. So suddenly it's not a World Cup for the region anymore. It's something that they want to have taken away from Qatar for their own political reasons. But there's one legacy that I think they could accidentally have, and that is Qatar is reforming, at least in words and partially in deeds, the kafala system in a way that isn't happening anywhere else in the Middle East. It's not happening in the UAE. It certainly isn't happening in the UAE or Saudi Arabia. And if that legacy, if it means that workers are paid fairly, treated fairly, and the pipeline of exploitation, at least it's the beginning of the end of that, then that could be one of the greatest legacies of a tournament of all time. And that is, if we keep the fire at their feet, I think that is possible.
Excellent stuff. Any other questions?
Yeah, we've got some good ones coming in now. So so two that I'll link together. So Patrick, to your documentary, clearly they became aware of you when you were shooting video. I'm guessing this is the authorities. Did this hamper your further reporting? You followed how you handled? And Harriet asks what the biggest challenges were that you faced reporting in Qatar on this topic.
Well, there's been a couple of hairy moments. I mean, that moment, luckily, I mean, I've got my press card, so that actually helps in a lot of situations. When I watched what was happening with the Esperance fans and we were filming, I mean, to be honest, we shouldn't really be filming in the stadium anyway. I mean, it would be much tougher if it's a World Cup because of broadcaster rights, for instance, right? So it wouldn't be unusual for somebody with a mobile phone to get yoinked out. But this time, it was the police saw us filming them basically going out of control and batoning people, and we got dragged out. So we got dragged out. We thought like anything could happen now. And I didn't take out my press card immediately because I wanted to see how the situation developed. And, you know, they were extremely aggressive, you know, threatened all sorts of things, threatened arrest. And I knew that would be deportation. And as soon as the press card came out, that's when a Qatari national was brought in to smooth the situation and let me get back in. So it was, you know, it was dealt with in that way. But there's been other occasions when in 2016, when I was writing the Billionaires Club, I was taken to various labour camps that are kind of government approved, where the conditions are quite good. They've got a barbers, they have a kitchen, they have a cricket match set up for people because most of the workers are from Bangladesh, Pakistan, India. They don't like football, they prefer cricket. And, you know, the conditions are pretty decent compared to most other camps in the Middle East. But if you go to the centre of the country in Shahania, where there is a kind of, you know, it's like a Mad Max of these ramshackle camps. And to get into there, I had a Ukrainian photographer with me at the time, and we had to wait because they're all heavily guarded, and we had to wait for a water truck to go in past the security so we could run behind the security truck, behind the truck, so the security couldn't see us. And we had to sneak in, and we met loads of guys, Ghanaian guys, who were just living in the most appalling conditions. So to see the real exploitation, you have to take those kind of risks. And we were lucky because we got out, we had a taxi waiting, we got straight back into the city. But I mean, I feel quite guilty because there was a Norwegian TV crew who I told this story to. And they're like, oh, go, yeah, we're thinking of going in. And I was like, well, I told them this story. And then they're like, okay. And then I saw a news report about 3 days later that they'd all been arrested for trying the same thing. I should laugh, really. But so it is extremely dangerous. I mean, extremely dangerous. You're not going to be tortured. You know, I mean, you're going to be arrested, you're going to be deported, and you're probably going to be banned from entering the country. One other thing I'd mention as well is that every time I go to Qatar now, something happens with my passport and I'm told to go and wait somewhere else. And eventually they let me through. And then there's a white 4x4 that follows you to your hotel to make sure that you're going to where you say you're going to. So the journalists, they'll let you in and they'll let you report quite freely as long as you don't step over certain lines. But it's still quite a dangerous, yeah, you could easily get arrested for covering the story in this way.
Got a really interesting question here from Jen. So thinking about the culture, how will it be for female fans in 2022?
Well, I think it'll be extremely respectful. It's not a country like Saudi Arabia, which until very recently had banned women from attending football matches. Even in the UAE, I remember seeing segregated fans when I went to, I think, the 2007 Gulf Cup. And I remember it was so obvious because the entire stadium was white because everybody was wearing, it was UAE versus Saudi Arabia. Everybody was wearing white thobes. And you saw there was one corner that was just black because it was the black abaya. So they had segregated fans for that. But Qatar's been a little bit different in that there's been absolutely no segregation, and because lewd behaviour, like swearing in public, aggressive behaviour, the kind of things that you often might see at football matches, on the edges of football matches everywhere else in Europe, which don't make it particularly family friendly, That's absolutely frowned upon, and will be cracked down on very heavily. So it's going to be, they'll call it a family experience. I mean, World Cups don't tend to be particularly, you don't tend to get the aggressive hooligans turning up for them, but it's going to be much more respectful in that respect, I think. And I think you're going to more likely to see what happened in 2002, which will be, a World Cup that will pass almost without incident in that respect.
Just the last couple then. Got a nice question here from Joe. Will Newcastle versus PSG be the new Gulf Derby?
Well, if it goes ahead, just to explain the question, it looks like Newcastle are about to be bought by Public Investment Fund, which is one of the two sovereign investment funds of Saudi Arabia. The chairman is Mohammed bin Salman, very controversial figure, a man who is accused of some of complicity in some of the worst human rights abuses of the past few years, especially when it comes to the war in Yemen and the atrocities taking place there, which is prosecuted largely by Saudi Arabia at the behest of Mohammed bin Salman, and also what happened to Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post Saudi dissident who was dismembered at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. So if it goes ahead, there's absolutely no doubt that it's going to be as similar to when Manchester City, which is owned by the royal family of Abu Dhabi, and they meet, it's going to be exactly the same thing. I mean, luckily, if it happens in the next 12 months, that match probably won't have the same bite than it would have done if it took place 2 years ago, when Qatar and Saudi Arabia split all diplomatic relations because of this Gulf blockade. And in fact, I mean, the Saudis they closed all the roads. They were even at one point discussing digging a trench, because they have a border, across the border and filling it full of nuclear waste. So, I mean, it sounds almost like a childlike, trolling of Qatar.
You had a very strange childhood.
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's something you do at a computer game or something, like if you're online, I'm going to build you. So like a teenage boy would come up with, I'm going to surround you with nuclear waste, man. And so they came up with that. So, yeah, it will be that. And I think I think it looks likely that it's going to go ahead. And I think it's an incredibly problematic sale. And I think that I've already seen the kind of online debate surrounding it. It's already poisonous. And I think there's huge moral issues about, it's fine if you're a private businessman perhaps, but this is the state of Saudi Arabia with all the things that it has done in terms of executions, women's rights, torture in jails, dismembering journalists, just some of the worst human rights you can imagine. And it is, if you care about any of those issues, you will never find a stronger correlation between a thing that you love being owned by somebody who's been accused of very bad things than Newcastle United and the Saudi, royal family, effectively.
Perfect stuff. I think with that's probably going to have to be our last question, unless Rob, you're going to disagree with me.
We can have some more if you want. I mean,
Yeah, we can stay.
Do you know what? I've got one last. I've got lots here. So apologies to those who didn't kind of make it through, but I'm going to fold together one from Ines and one from Anders. So Ines is asking about the infrastructure. So there's all of these kind of cases of banded infrastructure after Olympic Games. Whether you believe that there is actually a plan for so many hotels and so many stadiums in a country where there's such a small population, such a small football culture. And Anders, on the same sort of area, is talking about regarding these improvements of migrant rights and the tournament's legacy. Is that going to last beyond the last game of the World Cup?
Well, I mean, you'd hope so. The problem is, I guess, I mean, you're right. It's always a worry. In fact, it was a worry when we were thinking that it was, a few years ago, I think even a year ago, it looked like it could be possible that Qatar might lose the World Cup, because you've got to think that Gianni Infantino, the president of FIFA, is a big ally of Mohammed bin Salman. I mean, if you look at the World Cup 2018 opening match, Saudi Arabia, Russia, who's up in the stands? In the middle, it's Infantino, Mohammed bin Salman on one side, Vladimir Putin on the other. and so some of the actions within FIFA seem to have always fallen on Saudi and UAE sides against Qatar. And also Qatar wasn't a kind of mess of his, it was a mess of Blatter's. So, but the issue is that, taking away the World Cup from Qatar would probably destroy FIFA. And so probably in terms of the legal battles that follow. So it's something that that probably won't happen, but they look like it might do if it got serious, and especially with this political blockade that was taking place. And I remember talking to a lot of human rights activists, and it was like, well, who's going to get the blame? If it gets taken away, it's going to come down ultimately on the shoulders of the migrant workers, and they will bear the brunt of that, whether that would be because they were explicitly blamed for the World Cup being lost and the loss of face in the world, or because it'd be taken away and kind of, all of the reforms will be reversed. I mean, you'd hope that the reforms by then would be so deep that it would be impossible to row back on, and that it will be a permanent state of affairs. But you just don't know. But I do know that something is happening that isn't happening elsewhere. And as like I said earlier, this is one of the worst, facets of capitalism in the 21st century that I've witnessed, and I think many other people have witnessed. And if there's a chance that it won't be like this in the future, then I think we should take it.
I mean, Blatter did say last week, he suggested that USA could hold it if the indictment upholds these bribery claims. But you don't think that's a likely course of action?
Well, I think that it's difficult for Infantino because, he's somebody who's thrown his lot in so visibly with Russia and with Vladimir Putin, the president. And of course, it's not just Qatar that's been fingered in this indictment. And these are just allegations at the moment. And this has been a 10-year case. So this could go on for a long, long, long time still. And I probably might even go on past the World Cup. I doubt it would take place. They might not get a verdict before then. But also, there's accusations that Jack Warner, the famous CONCACAF executive from Tonga, took money from the Russia bid, $5 million. Those are in the documents. So if you go after Qatar, you go after Russia. And I don't think that is something politically that Infantino has the stomach for. And I think that whichever way it falls, this will be. I mean, we see a little bit with Manchester City at the moment being accused of, breaking financial fair play rules, right? And UEFA punishing them. Their way, I mean, all the leaked emails that have come out, if true, show this is an organisation that its culture comes from the very top, the ruling elite within the UAE, which is we will destroy you rather than accept guilt. And I suspect that if FIFA take that path, that they're, ultimately Qatar's pockets are far, 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 far deeper than FIFA's, and they, don't fuck with the state. They'll get you in the end. There's that brilliant quote from what was it? I can't even remember the name of the bloody TV series. It's gone. I'll come up with it later.
It's gone. The state's got to you. no mess here.
Well, Kevin Spacey plays the president.
House of Cards?
House of Cards. And there's a businessman who makes a lot of money in China, and he says, I think his name's Tusk, and he says, Tusk, you might have all the money, but I've got all the guns. And I think that's ultimately where the power of a state is, and I think that's ultimately how it would shake down. That if it comes to a toe-to-toe fight between FIFA and UEFA, or a state, then they will ultimately lose.
James, it's been fantastic. I found it fascinating. We could have spoken for twice as long. We've already overshot. I really appreciate it. As James was mentioning, he's got a new book out. It's your fourth book, yeah. Fourth book, which is 1312 Among the Ultras. You can get it off the GG shop, so the Slow Journalism shop. We've got copies. They're actually signed by James, which is great. James is going to be back teaching a quite kind of tailored class for a handful of people that are interested in how to be a non-fiction author. So you get really fantastic access with a man that's been there and done it. He's going to cover every element of it, getting a deal, getting an agent, talking it through with kind of tailored feedback on your pitches. That's coming up on the 12th of May, I think, if anyone's interested. This time in a fortnight, we've got Harriet, who's talking about an absolutely terrific piece about Ebola. and the kind of the pros and cons of how to fight a killer virus, which could not be more timely. Still not mentioning the C word. But other than that, I just really want to say thank you again. Thank you to everyone for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for listening.